ability to play this back later, maybe offer it up to our attendees and our partners should they want to go back and review some of the material in this webinar. Also, just a quick note, at the bottom of your window in this Zoom webinar, there is a list of menu choices. One of them says Q&A. And if you click on that, it will open up a short window where you can enter your questions. At the end of this webinar, we'll be answering any questions that are put forth in the Q&A. There's also a chat. Well, one of our team members here may not be paying attention to the chat because they are paying attention to the Q&A. So please make sure that you use the Q&A button if you have any questions that you'd like to ask. Terrific. So before we get started, I want to make note of why we are actually beginning with a risk assessment as our first webinar in the Selling Security series. It's because that we have found that risk assessments are the single biggest lever in terms of driving new security business to our MSP partners who use our Cyberglass platform, who use our PII Guard 360 platform. The risk assessment is a key differentiator relative to what an MSP and an MSSP offers. MSPs don't offer true risk assessments typically. MSSPs offer NIST-compliant risk assessments. And there is a big difference between a non-NIST and a NIST-compliant risk assessment. And as I've said, the risk assessment has been the single biggest driver of new business for our MSP partners. And so we're kicking off our Selling Security series with risk assessments and how to leverage them and lever them against your competitors to drive new revenue. Our agenda looks short. We've got a lot to cover in this. I'm going to jump right in. There's going to be some slides that I go past very quickly. So if you have questions, again, please make sure that you click that Q&A icon at the bottom of the Zoom meeting screen so that you can ask a question. Our team members are monitoring that, and they will relay them to me at the end of this webinar for me to answer for you. So first, I want you to think bigger. What does that mean? A typical MSP thinks within the four corners of technology. And so if you think about what you do as an MSP or an IT service provider or an IT consultant, you tend to look at an enterprise relative to their technology footprint, either the footprint that they have today or the footprint you believe they need to have to be successful, which has been a terrific thing for MSPs to do. In fact, it's what made MSPs dominant in the space and pushed out the smaller one-man bands who came in haphazardly, and why really MSPs mushroomed. But MSP as a vertical has sort of plateaued. It's one of the reasons why you've seen larger marketing concerns like Robin Robbins and others pushing security as a lever to drive new business, because the MSP space has effectively plateaued. And so what we want you to do is think bigger, think beyond the four corners of technology that sit in your client space or your prospect's place, and think bigger to the company, what they're doing and how they work and how they operate. Because it's important to remember that an MSP is not an MSSP. The difference between the two are huge. An MSP, again, thinks within the four corners of tech. An MSSP thinks about the way the C-suite thinks and feels about the corporate culture of their clients. And it delivers services and products that speaks to that. And so, again, an MSP is not an MSSP. So as you begin to think bigger, you begin to think beyond the four corners of technology. Because when you're thinking bigger, you begin to realize that IT consulting and management, what MSPs do all the time, is not risk management. It's actually risk mitigation, because you're putting in solutions and services to mitigate risk at the technological layer of the enterprise. And you're doing a terrific job at that. So that's not to say that you're doing a bad job, but it's risk mitigation. It is not risk management. MSSPs sell risk management and mitigation because of the way that they speak to the company. So why is risk management so important? Well, first of all, it's the law. Many of you on this call, I know some of you, I don't know all of you, but many of you on this call already know many of these laws that you see here today. HIPAA's been out there for a while. DFARS, SOX, high-tech, etc. These are all federal regulations that have been imposed on businesses in a variety of vertical markets. Part and parcel of the problem with these regulations is they've had very little teeth in them. And so what you've come to find is that when you try to bring technological solutions to your customers or prospects that are inside of the verticals that these laws speak to, they are a difficult sell. They're a difficult sell not because they don't think they need them, but they view it as an expense, and ultimately they don't see the risk associated with it because the law has no teeth. There's no auditor walking through the door tomorrow. In fact, the likelihood of an auditor walking through the door is few and far between. And so while these laws have been on the books for some time nationally, they haven't had enough teeth to drive business. And I would say that to a person on this call, if I asked you if you've approached a doctor's office or you've approached a defense contractor, well, they're actually more so. They would actually fall under that and be exposed to it because part of the bid process. But that notwithstanding, if you were to approach somebody who was obligated under one of these regs to a person, you would say, yes, it's a hard sell because they view it as an expense. And so those national laws have been around for quite some time. The state regulations that have been coming about, New York State more recently than actually, some have been more recent than that, but this one had more teeth in New York State Department of Financial Services, and that's the cybersecurity reg in New York State. But as of May 2018, May of last year, every single state in the union, in fact, every state in the union, Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, and all of the U.S. territories have some sort of cybersecurity regulation under which certain verticals, if not all businesses are obligated to follow. Some of them are simple regulations. So think about notification laws, breach notification laws. Almost every single state in the union has a breach notification law. Again, businesses don't think about that aspect of it because there's no teeth behind it. The states aren't coming in and auditing. It's not until those regulations push down to bodies of enforcement. So again, coming back to New York State Department of Financial Services, when they enacted 23 NYCRR 500, which is the cybersecurity regulation of New York State from the Department of Financial Services, they also installed a panel of cybersecurity auditors. And so when they go through and they audit all of the verticals in their charge, part and parcel of their what's called a first day letter includes 26 cybersecurity questions very specific to policies, procedures, technologies, etc. And so with that teeth came wholesale adoption of cybersecurity technologies and services. And very quickly, we saw our partners, our CyberGuard partners who use CyberGlass and PII Guard, become number one in their market, closing as many as 2 new clients a week because of that regulation. And why that's important is not so much because people now got it, that they needed to get it because it's a great technology. It's because the government said, we are now monitoring and making sure you do this. And so there's nothing like a big sledgehammer of government to make people move. But those clients that have adopted it have realized terrific security on their end from our MSP partners. And the MSPs who have employed it have seen mid-6-figure revenue streams from this in ARR. So there has been a huge boon to them, and which is why cybersecurity risk management relative to cybersecurity is such a key to this, and the risk assessment is a core driver of that. GDPR, and yes, that's a picture of me. That was our little joke. GDPR, if you haven't heard of that, that is the General Data Protection Regulation that was enacted in Europe, and it is on its way here. It's now in place in over 30 countries in some form or fashion. And so GDPR as a regulation, what they do is they put the onus on every single business. So unlike these regulations, national and state and municipal regulations that have been in place for years and years and years, these speak to specific vertical markets. And again, in the absence of teeth by the government, they mean nothing to our average businessman, and therefore it's been a tough sell. GDPR is different. GDPR affects every single business. It doesn't matter the vertical. And it puts the onus of protection on the business owner. And it says that any business that holds and is responsible for basically is the custodian of, whether it's in a read-only fashion or in a manipulative fashion, meaning that they can manipulate the data inside it. They are responsible to protect that data. And if they don't, the fines are harsh. They are serious. They will put you out of business. In the GDPR world, it's 4% of global revenue. So imagine a Google of the world with billions of dollars in revenue, what that means to them, or $25 million. And so these are significant penalties, and they're a sledgehammer that are used to force businesses to take significant steps at improving their cybersecurity posture. And the GDPR reg is due to come to the United States by 2021. CyberGuard 360 keeps track of regulations in all 50 states and all U.S. territories in Washington, D.C. Furthermore, we keep a track at the federal level on what's happening relative to regulation around cybersecurity, data privacy, and protection so that we can avail our partners of what's going on. In fact, we've got a web page, and I will make sure, I know Colin's on the phone, I'll make sure that we send that around to everybody on this call so you can keep abreast of what regulations are working their way through different committees under review when they hit the legislative calendar, so you know when they're hitting your state. Examples of New York's DFS cybersecurity regulation are showing up in Virginia and Georgia and Florida and California, and some of them are already enacted today. So laws matter. They matter for a variety of reasons, obviously. As it relates to cybersecurity, they matter because they are requiring business be proactive in protecting data, protecting PII, personally identifiable information. And what's interesting about the GDPR reg, as it's worked its way across the pond, as they say, to the United States, is the same enforcement levers that GDPR is using are still included in what's being bandied about in DC. So it's important to know that because, again, I said earlier, in the absence of teeth, nobody will do anything. Okay? So as we think about risk management, and again, this is really a call about risk management where it begins with a risk assessment. As we think about risk management, it's important to realize really how your prospects and your clients, how they think about risk management. And in a survey done of CEOs of companies of a variety of sizes by Deloitte, 70% of the C-suite believes they own risk. And in fact, they do. I could argue all day long that it's their responsibility because they are responsible for the corporate culture of the company. And they are also responsible for everything that happens underneath them, even to those whom they delegate. And so they are ultimately responsible for risk management. The good news is that they know it. 70% of them see that and say, yes, I own this. Another 29% have it handed off to an advisory team that reports back to the C-suite for them to own it. So what we're really saying here is 99% of business owners out there know that they own risk, that it's their responsibility to successfully manage the risk posture of their enterprise. And that's great news for you guys. That's great news for every MSP and every MSSP, every MSP who wants to be an MSP. Because if the C-suite knows it, they also start to not think about risk as a cost center, but a cultural norm. And the biggest hurdles any MSP on this call will tell you is that when you try to sell them another security solution from a technology perspective, they view that managed firewall as a cost center. They view the AV or the next gen endpoint protection as a cost center. They view all of these technological levers that we know are great for them, but as they view as a cost center, and therefore they're always comparing it on a price basis. When you speak above that with a risk assessment in terms of risk management, you're speaking to the C-suite who already know that culturally they need to be risk aware, they need to be risk averse, and they need to imply into the organization, into the culture of the company, levers that change, that drive a more secure posture, that protect their client data, their PII more securely. So this is actually a terrific visual for you to take back, because it's telling you now that by looking at security in a bigger way, beyond the four corners of technology, you've already got buy-in to the C-suite. You've overcome the first hurdle, which is, why do I need it? They already know they own risk, and they know they need to do something about it. Interestingly enough, they also know where they fall down. And so many of them think that they do risk assessments well. So if you look at this chart, some 60+% of them think they do a good job of risk assessments. I can tell you from our partners who have used risk assessments to come in and assess risk from a corporate culture perspective all the way down to the technology envelope, and we're going to talk about all of that today, that they actually don't know how to assess risk. Because what they're doing is that they're looking at risk through the narrow confines of technology, and they don't think about the other drivers that really expose them. Think about their employees and how many of them click on infected emails or phishing attacks, because they don't think about that as part of their risk profile. And they only look at, yeah, we've got a great firewall. Yeah, we've got great endpoint protection. Yeah, we have a great MSP who's paying attention to all that stuff. Well, that's awesome. I'm sure you're taking care of that network environment. And I'm sure you're protecting them to the best of your ability relative to technology. But the larger envelope of the company and the way that they manage risk individually and amongst themselves as well is what risk assessments speak to, what NIST, National Institute of Standards and Testing, which is a federal bureaucracy, but they are what define a risk assessment and how it should look, and we'll talk about that in a moment. I'm going to breeze through those slides. So they're not actually doing risk assessments terrifically, but let's assume for argument's sake that they are. What they also are telling us in this survey is that they are doing a poor job of closing the gaps those risk assessments have identified. Some 85% are saying that they fail to correlate data or find root cause analyses relative to when they've had a breach or fallen down in risk. Some 75% of them also say that they do a poor job when it comes to protecting data from loss, or they do a poor job of infusing a risk-secure posture into the company, how they change the culture so that everybody becomes a defender of the enterprise from a risk perspective. And so again, this is great news for everybody, or at least everybody on this call. It's great news because they know that they own risk, and they know that they are falling down, and they are waiting for that white knight in his or her cape to fly in and help them close these gaps. Because all too often, what happens is they think of risk within that silo we talked about earlier, and they reach out to their IT provider and say, can you help me? And the IT provider says, sure, I'll put in this firewall, I'll manage it for you. I may have a SIM, and I'll use that to monitor the event logs, and I may have great endpoint protection. But beyond the four corners of tech, nobody knows what to do. And there's no one person or company out there beyond the Fortune 500 reach that are able to help small and medium businesses in that regard. And so I want to empower you guys to be able to do that. And that's how a risk assessment begins this process. Okay? This is what a risk assessment can do for your client. They already know this. This is a quick slide. I'm going to go past this. Again, when you have an opportunity to go back and look at this, you can read this in more detail. But effectively, they know they own risk. They know they're falling down. And if a risk assessment is done properly, they know that they have enhanced governance, that risk management becomes part of their corporate culture. They can prioritize their posture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are things that your clients already know internally. And what a risk assessment does is it allows you to bring it to the fore. It allows you to show them where they're falling down and how you're going to help them get back up. They already know they're falling down. Sometimes they don't know where. A good risk assessment, a NIST-based risk assessment, tells them where. And the key to this is not being an MSP, because again, MSPs are traditionally thought of as the four corners of the technology envelope. It's you become an MSSP. And that large S in green is because that's where the money is. We said earlier that MSPs were becoming commoditized, and that a lot of the people on this call, a lot of the people in markets near you, they fight on endpoint price, on per endpoint pricing or per user pricing. They've capped out their per user at maybe $90, $125, $185. But the underlying cost structure for that, as that continues to increase, ever shrink your margins. The MSSP has an unlimited source of opportunity. It's unlimited for a lot of reasons, the largest of which the C-suite knows they own risk, the C-suite knows they're falling down, and the C-suite wants to do something about it. And more importantly, they also know that regulations are coming. GDPR is on its way. It's going to be here by 2021. They must do something. It is quite literally the beginning of a windfall for good MSSPs. So this is the standard. We talked about NIST earlier. I'm not going to dive into these slides because there is a lot to talk about relative to the NIST risk management framework and the NIST cybersecurity framework. I'm showing this to you because I want you to understand sort of how risk assessments are developed within these frameworks. These are standards used across every industry all over the world, frankly. So what's happened in Europe, actually the framework of GDPR is a collaboration of NIST and the European Standards Board. And so what you see here, in fact, is a broader framework of GDPR. And so the NIST risk management framework speaks to a variety of things inside and outside of technology. The cybersecurity framework tells you how you deal with that, okay? And then inside the cybersecurity framework is 800-171 is how it's commonly used. You might call it NIST SP 800-171, but this is the standard by which risk assessments are formed and measured. and they talk about how you use a risk assessment to look at all areas of the company. So if you take a look at that wheel, you will see that there isn't an area of any company of any size. I don't care if you are servicing a one-man band client or you're servicing a client with 1,000 employees. Every single company of every single size has some degree of every element in this wheel. And risk assessments, even though risk assessments is a subcomponent of this wheel, actually evaluates the entire landscape. And 800-171 is the standard by which risk assessments are created, developed, and informed relative to any non-federal computer. Basically, every business system out there. It doesn't matter. As long as it's not a governmental system, a non-federal, a federal government system, this is the standard by which risk assessments are developed. Okay? So within that standard, as I said, you've got 5 steps to cover. Risk assessment is one component of that, but risk assessment evaluates every element of the organization. So it looks at asset management, business environment, governance, strategy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll look at how it does that. But as we go through this deck, I want you to think about this wheel and these items underneath every one of those pieces of the pie, and you'll start to see how a risk assessment speaks to all of them. Because ultimately, risk assessments are where policy meets procedure. It's where process meets people. And it's where culture meets compliance. And if you think about it, that's everything in the organization. And this is absolutely true. Because when you do a risk assessment, you are looking at the entirety of the entity as a living, breathing organism. And so what has the company's culture done relative to both developing a set of policies and procedures? How does the procedure speak to those policies relative to, are they satisfactory? Are they doing their job? Are the people executing those processes? And do all those policies and processes comply with the corporate culture and comply with the regulations to which they are burdened or obligated, to comply? Now, this doesn't mention technology. Notice that. Because inside of policies and procedures are the technological elements as well. But they specifically don't mention technology because risk assessments only have technology as a subcomponent of them. And so when you do a risk assessment, you're interviewing the C-suite and you're interviewing people. You're also doing an IT audit. And we'll see that in a moment. Because risk assessments ultimately are designed to expose the intersection of every aspect of the company, of the organization, where everything meets. Where do people meet process? Where do policy and process converge? How culture and compliance work their way down through this organism called our client and their company. Let's take a look at some of the elements of a risk assessment. You've probably seen risk assessments before if you've used, I know there are lots of vendors out there that offer what they call a risk assessment. They are typically not NIST-compliant risk assessments. I won't mention names because they're in their own space doing their own thing, and more power to them. But a NIST-compliant risk assessment will have inputs and outputs. And the inputs are what you take in when you perform a risk assessment. They should be, if done properly, both on-site and remote. You can do things like interview people over the phone, such as the C-suite, but when you want to go and interview key members of the organization further down the company, you want to do that in their element, because you also want to see how they're interacting inside the company with the technology and with each other. What you're looking for is the culture that the C-suite has conveyed in your interview, is that actually showing itself in its policies? And are the people complying with those policies? Because sometimes, depending on the size of the company or depending on how it's structured, the C-suite is absolutely certain that they're doing a great job. But by the time you get down to the person at the desk, they're ignoring it. Now, you'll have technological drivers that can fix that, right? So you might have technological drivers that say you have to change your password every so often. But that notwithstanding, there may be other policies and procedures that say don't leave sensitive information on your desk. You wouldn't know that if you haven't done an on-site visit. And so they may think everybody's doing their job, but until somebody goes and looks, you don't know for sure that they're doing their job. And so a risk assessment exposes that as one of the inputs. Vulnerability assessments, these are physical and technological vulnerability assessments. And the technological ones you all know. You're all MSPs. You all know what technological vulnerability assessments look like. A typical well-known one is OpenVAS, OpenVAS. And if you know how to use it, it's a great vulnerability assessment tool. Rapid-fire tools with Network Detective also has a scaled-down version of a vulnerability assessment. It does a decent job, so it's certainly something that you can use in that regard. I would certainly recommend using both of those, and there are still others out there. But physical vulnerability assessments. We had one of our partners who did an on-site visit to an insurance company, a very large insurance company, and when they walked in the door, literally when they walked in the door and they were standing there at the front desk, and nobody was there, by the way, nobody was at the front desk, they told us, and they looked to their right, they were able to see somebody's screen, and right away they failed the audit before they did anything, because sitting on the person's screen was an insurance application with a social security number, and it was just on the other side of a window that they installed themselves. So they positioned their people in a way that automatically doesn't meet the standard of protecting PII. And so a physical vulnerability assessment is an element of this as well. And then, of course, there's the IT audit. Everybody on this call, I'm sure, does an IT audit. I'm not going to belabor that point. Again, Rapid Fire Tools is a great product to use for something like that. We don't sell it, so I'm not promoting that because we sell that as a solution. Just that it's a great tool and something to look at. And there are others out there. Plus, you can roll your own. The output of the risk assessment, that column header is green because this is where your money is. And this is how you make money, not just in terms of the risk assessment itself, but the ongoing outputs that you're going to deliver to them. So necessarily when you do a risk assessment, you're going to give them a completed report, you're going to give them a work plan, policies and procedures, and then you'll have prescriptive controls that you're going to put in place. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So these are some of the inputs we talked about. You're doing the interview process. Now, a NIST-compliant risk assessment covers the three key areas of the enterprise. In fact, the three areas of the enterprise that cover the entire organization. So you have the administrative aspect. That's talking to the way the company lives and breathes, the C-suite, if you would. It also talks about how the organization is structured physically, right? That's the physical aspects of it. And then finally, the technological aspects of it, which looks at the technology in there. So the three broad areas, administrative, physical, and technical. And then within that wheel that we talked about, you've got those three items that you're looking for: identify, protect, and detect. So we're looking at everything within the enterprise relative to those three areas in a NIST-compliant fashion. And the interview process, as an example, looks at how the organization believes it's positioned. We said earlier, we're talking to the C-suite. They have a belief in the way that their company is positioned from a risk posture perspective. What controls they believe they have in place. And where they believe their security SWOT lies. SWOT: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And so that's typically used in marketing, but a SWOT analysis can be used for anything, and we use it in terms of risk assessments relative to security. Where are they strong? Where are they weak? Where do we have opportunities of improvements? And where do threats lie that we need to button up that part of the attack surface so that we can mitigate that risk? And so a risk assessment looks at that SWOT, and you do that through the interview process, both a physical and on-site. And we talk a little bit about the face-to-face interview. So that tells you how the organization is actually positioned. So remember, this interview process here looks at what they believe they're doing. This is that C-suite interview. This on-site, this face-to-face, alongside the IT audit and alongside the vulnerability assessment, this tells you how they're really positioned, what controls they really have in place, where the organization's actual SWOT is relative to what they think. That's the gap. If you remember that bar chart we talked about a little bit earlier, they thought they were great on risk assessments but weak in all those other areas. That is the delta, the difference between what they believe and what's actually in place. And so these inputs inform all of that. And from that wealth of information that you've gathered, you provide them the output. And the output takes the form of a risk assessment. That's a submittal document, the where you actually are document. You also provide them a work plan. A work plan is effectively, in this case, it's a spreadsheet, and we provide you a spreadsheet if you're a PII Guard partner. That spreadsheet says, okay, this is where you have deficiencies or gaps in your security posture. It also provides prescriptive recommendations. And this is where, that's the money shot for you. Because what you're providing them then is, this is your gap, this is how we can help you. And they include things like follow-up audits, and which, by the way, will need to be annual and or when the environment materially changes. That is the language of the regulations. When the environment materially changes, you must do another audit and another assessment. It will include training, any remediation that has to be done, additional layers of protective and prescriptive services that you can deliver. And that is effectively the money shot for MSSPs. It says this is where they've fallen down and this is where you can help them. And it's presented to them in, this is the gaps we've identified, and these are our recommendations for how to mitigate the risks associated with them. Some of them are project-based, and therefore you generate project revenue. Some of them are ongoing services, where you generate MRR or ARR, annual recurring revenue. For instance, you do an annual risk assessment. It fills the gaps to harden the attack surface. All too often, MSPs look at the attack surface as being that technological layer, but the attack surface we talked about earlier is throughout the company, throughout the enterprise, throughout the organization. And you have an obligation to help them fill those gaps in. And then you filling that in is your revenue line. And it's all it's not all top line revenue, but it all goes to the top line revenue with significant margins. When I say significant, we have risk assessments where people are making 90% on the dollar. So the margins are huge, depending on what you're selling. And these are just a sample of some of the things that you can deliver. VCISO stands for Virtual Chief Information Security Officer. Some of the regs that I showed earlier on require that you have a CISO and or an outsourced CISO, known as a VCISO, to monitor and make sure that the risk mitigation strategies employed are actually being used and effective. Okay? So what can a risk assessment do for you? And we talked a little bit about that a moment ago. But what an MSSP can do, MSPs and IT consultants can't. And it doesn't mean that because MSSPs are smarter or they're better. It's because they're viewed differently. We talked earlier about the fact that the C-suite knows they own risk. They know they've fallen down in protecting the organization relative to their risk posture. So when an MSSP speaks about their risk assessment, they're not talking to the person who's buying computers. Sometimes they are, depending on the size of the company. But the person that's on the other side of that desk is thinking about, or you're helping them think about, how exposed are they as a company? Not because someone might get a phishing email and let loose some information about their bank account, but because their people are not following the policies that were put in place. Look at how different that conversation is. When you're speaking to a C-suite, we're speaking to the owner of a company. I use C-suite, it sounds like I'm talking about just big businesses. Really, I'm talking about any size company. It doesn't matter. When you're having a conversation about the way their team interacts with their technology and each other, the way they interact with the company and their clients, you're having a completely different conversation than you need 5 new PCs, because this is end of life and Microsoft is no longer supporting Windows 7. And that conversation takes you from a cost center spending their money to a trusted advisor helping them be safe. Think for a minute about corporate counsel. They don't really look at corporate counsel as a cost center. Sometimes they look at them as necessary evils, but they know that what they're getting from that counsel is advice to be safe legally. You are becoming that advisor from a risk perspective. And you're doing this levering the risk assessment. You couldn't do that with an IT audit. It is impossible to do it with an IT audit. And so you're able to give the C-suite visibility into what their company really looks like. Remember, we said earlier, they know they're falling down. This risk assessment tells them where they're falling down and how to fix it. That's where you're different than anybody else who walks through that door. You're also informing them about their strategy and mission statements and how well the execution of their business comports to their strategy and mission statements. These are very big ideas, so I don't want you to get nervous about them, because really they're all being uncovered in the risk assessment. And it's a simple walk in the park, if you would, to get here. It allows you the opportunity to move beyond MSP and expand your suite of offerings as an MSSP, because you're having this different conversation. You're bringing in things like literally on-site training. Maybe you're giving quarterly security training sessions to your clients. Maybe you're doing some now, but you're really talking about phishing emails. What you can do with a risk assessment as an additional service you can offer is quarterly policy and procedure reviews and how well they're comporting with them, because you're also going to help write those policies and procedures. You'll be able to increase project revenue, MRR, with post-RA work plan services. I don't want to belabor this because I know we're butting up against time, and add or increase your MRR and your ARR, your annual recurring revenue. So I'm going to take questions in a minute, but you've attended this webinar. You bore with me for the last, I wouldn't say bore as in I bored you, bore with me for the last 45 minutes. I don't know if there's any questions out there, but I want to make sure that I get to them. These are some of the things that we're going to give you for attending. So everybody who stayed to the end, Colin knows who you all are. You're going to get an email from us. Should be by the end of today, but it may be by the end of Friday, I'm not sure, on where you can go to download a marketing campaign called Regulations Are Coming. You saw that picture early on of me with the Regulations Are Coming. We have a full campaign on that, letter and a call script, along with a postcard for drip marketing. If you want to use your own image in there, we'll also give you the person that we use who swaps images out for us. We'll give you a direct connection to them. If you're interested in CyberGuard services, we offer CyberGlass SIM 2.0, which is an MSSP in a box solution. We offer PII Guard 360, which is a breach prevention platform. For anybody who signs up for our breach prevention platform, we'll do a free migration from Breach Secure Now, BSN. So anybody that you already have in BSN will move over to PII Guard 360. And then finally, because we've had a lot of MSPs ask us about this, they're not sure how to do risk assessments, or they're not really sure how to develop work plans and how bolt-on strategies look or how policies should look. We will actually do the risk assessment for you in your name, a done-for-you service. We've had partners who sell that for at least $49.95, so MSRP, it depends on the size of the enterprise. And we'll do that for you for $29.95. The only thing that we don't do is the on-site piece. So if you wanted us to do that, that would cost additional. But that notwithstanding, you could do that. We'll tell you what to look for, and then we'll do the whole thing for you thereafter, including the interviewing, risk assess on the remote interview of the risk assessment, development of the work plan, suggestion on services, and things like that. Okay. So let me take the Q&A. I'll leave the contact information up on the screen. Colin, are there any questions out there that that some of our attendees had that I need to answer?
Just two of them. One is if Breach Secure Now, if that has multiple levels of service to it, does it include training in addition to risk assessments?
What, the PII Guard, you mean?
Well, it was a question to differentiate the two.
Okay, so we're different in a lot of respects, and I certainly don't. They do a good job, and I don't in any way, shape, or form mean to disparage them. We built it not to compete with them. We built it because it's got some additional elements to it that BSN doesn't have, and BSN has some elements which we don't have yet, but are coming. So one of the elements that we have in PII Guard 360 is, one, we've got over 40 policy and procedure templates that you can use for your clients. We have the ability to automate notification. What do I mean by that? So if you're monitoring and managing the behaviors of your clients' users, the people that work there, you can drive them to review the policies and procedures, not unlike BSN, and check off that they've attested to having read them, understand them, and will follow them. But then every time a policy or procedure changes, it will automatically notify the user that the policy is new. It will uncheck their attestation flag and notify the manager who's attested and who hasn't. So we have a much broader set of policy and procedure controls, which is a critical element to delivering these services, because if you're going to get in bed with the C-suite, you have to facilitate information for them. Which one of their employees are performing? How are they performing? Who isn't performing? How do we help them remediate? And so because we're able to notify you when your employees have attested or haven't attested, and we're able to notify them when policies have changed, that continuation, if you would, that extension of controls within policies and procedures is awesome. The other thing that we do differently than them is we are integrated with our with our CyberGlass SIM 2.0 platform, our MSSP in a box platform. And so what's coming on that platform that PII Guard 360 integrates with is it is going to automatically document incident response. So if you're in CyberGlass and you identify an incident, you tag that incident as something reportable, and when you're done working on the incident, it automatically writes it down to PII Guard 360. So automated documentation of incident response is the other one. And then again, there's other elements that we don't have that they have, but everything they have is on our roadmap for this year. And for every client that is on CyberGlass, you get PII Guard for free. I hope that answered the question. Go ahead. What was the next one?
Next and final one, a quick one. In addition to the free marketing materials and collateral, will either we host the slides or the recording through that portal?
So right now we are looking to host the recording. We haven't decided yet on the slide. It's not so much because we want to keep it from you. Certainly you were here to watch it. We'll probably put it behind a password protected portal. So the answer to that is yes. It'll be out there behind a password protected portal.
Okay, great. That was all the questions for today.
I see a few in the chat, so let me go there. I'm not going to name names, but let me see what I see here. 1 second.
Oh, yep.
I think the deck copy I already answered. Additional free marketing material. Yes. So aside from that, we are constantly adding marketing material for our partners. So the answer is yes. We actually sent an e-blast out to our partners a couple of days ago. We have syndicated content that we're offering up. We have other white label marketing collateral that our CyberGuard partners are going to have access to, and we are building campaigns alongside that. Okay. And then lastly, the CyberGuard partners get RA templates to conduct RAs themselves. So the answer is yes. So that's a self-serve model if you choose to go down that road. Inside the PII Guard 360 portal is a risk assessment. It's a Q&A. It's a yes, no, not applicable depending on the company. So you can answer those questions yourself and conduct the interview yourself. When you're done, it will automatically generate, automatically is a little strong, it will generate the risk assessment document and it will generate the work plan. Before the work plan gets distributed to your client, you'll have access to that almost immediately, by the way. So that's another area where we're different than BSN. Because we've automated all of that, we've been doing this for a long time. I used to be a chief compliance officer in one of my other businesses, and so I'm very familiar with the responses to risk assessments. So we've automated the production of the work plan. And so when you finish a work plan when you finish a risk assessment and mark it as complete in PII Guard, almost instantaneously, the risk assessment document and the work plan is available to you as partners. And then you have full control over when you want to give that to your client. And the reason we do that is you should never hand it off without looking at it, because you're going to be selling them services on top of that. And so a work plan is not something, set it and forget it. Here you go, have a nice day. You should be presenting that to them. Think about the way you give IT proposals. You would never sit down and give you would never email a proposal. Let me rephrase that. You should never email a proposal. Anybody who subscribes to the Robin Robbins Producers Club or any of her seminars knows that the truth of the matter is when you do a proposal, it should be face-to-face. So you can see what their responses is, listen to their objections, and answer them before they ask them. And so that's the same thing you should be doing with a risk assessment and work plan. The difference between the two is the risk assessment and work plan, you're speaking to the C-suite about their risk posture and how to mitigate it. When you're speaking to them about an IT proposal, you're speaking to them how much money they're going to spend. I can promise you that every single risk assessment that any one of our partners has ever done, they almost never talk about cost first. And it's not that they won't, the partner, their client says, how is it going to help me be more secure? And then it lands on price. What can they afford? When can they afford it? Okay? Any other questions out there? All right. Well, I appreciate everybody attending. You'll get something in your inbox shortly. If you have any questions, my information's up there on the screen. Feel free to reach out to me directly. Feel free to email us at Cell Security or go to cyberguard360.com. Contact us. And if you want to schedule a demo, that link's there as well. I appreciate it, everybody. Have a great day.